So welcome to our 21st CRWDP webinar. First, I'll start off by explaining just how the presentation will run today, and then I will introduce our presenter and we'll go from there. So in terms of the presentation, we'll have our introductions. After the presentation itself, there will be a Q&A. Before we get into the presentation, we've also wanted to add a land acknowledgement to our CRWDP webinars for the purpose of acknowledgement and sharing gratitude as well. So we wish to acknowledge this land on which we live and work. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. That acknowledgement is relevant to where we are currently in Toronto. I also would suggest knowing the communities within your respective locations as well. And so our researcher today presenting is Zhanna Lyubykh, and I hope that I pronounced that right, or close enough to right. Zhanna is a doctoral student in organizational behavior at the Haskayne School of Business at the University of Calgary. Her research interests lie at the intersection of employee well-being, occupational health, and leadership. So without further ado, Zhanna, take it away.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for the introduction. And I'm impressed with your ability to pronounce names. My name is absolutely not the easiest one to pronounce. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And I'm very excited to present this webinar, talk about some ideas, talk about some of my research, some ideas how we can get this to the next level. And again, thank you so much. I will just start with our agenda for today. So my plan for today, I will be talking about disability in the workplace context. And I want to cover three main themes. So first of all, we'll discuss why employees with disabilities may face different evaluations, different assessments from their managers. I'll go over some results of a recently published paper. And then I also want to talk about workplace accommodation. And of course, because of COVID, this is work from home is a very much prevalent topic. And it did COVID, of course, it has many disadvantages. But what it helped us understand is we can work from home quite successfully. But we also need to understand some pitfalls of working from home because it can be a wonderful arrangement for all employees, including employees with disabilities. But we need to make sure that we make those arrangements as much beneficial as we can. So I will start with the disability disclosure and managerial prejudice. So first of all, I'm sure that I probably don't need this slide at all because everyone in this audience knows that employees with disabilities, they face certain challenges when they try to find jobs, when they are employed. So should I talk about this? Yes, I will talk. I will still talk about this, but I'm sure this is very much obvious why it's important that we talk about disability and disability discrimination. So of course, everyone knows here that employees with disabilities and people with disabilities, they face lower employment rates. They also face negative attitudes, lower performance evaluations. They face different forms of discrimination. And of course, this is all from the perspective of employees with disabilities. It's important that for them, we ensure that we have fair workplaces, we have fair performance evaluations, we don't disadvantage. But it's also important that employers consider this perspective because if we want to make this work, we need to create a case for why it's important for employers from their perspective to consider challenges that employees with disabilities may face. So first of all, we know that a lot of times people acquire disability during their lifetime. And we do see in the population, we see growing rates of disability. A lot of times people also acquire disability while working. So it's not necessary that a person enters the workforce with a certain specific disability. It's also possible that a person, while employed, acquires a certain type of disability. And of course, with aging populations, we know that with age, we tend to acquire more disabilities. And this change in demographic have huge implications for the workforce, because in the future, we'll see more and more people who do have some sort of disability and who do require work accommodations. So when does discrimination happen? And of course, the first idea people have, the first assumption is it happens when people try to find employment. And this is, of course, true. But discrimination actually happens at all stages of the employment cycle. It's not necessarily when people try to find a job. It may happen while they are at work, when they try to get a promotion, when they try to advance their career. So we know quite a bit about employment and discrimination during the interview process, but we don't know a lot about a return to work context. So imagine a scenario, a person, employed person, acquires a disability while at work, and they need to take a short or long-term leave of absence. But then they re-enter the workforce they may re-enter, oftentimes they go into the same company. So this is an example of return to work context. I want to take a step back a little bit here and discuss a simple, I call it a brain teaser, but a puzzle. So take a minute to think about this example. A father and his son are in a car accident. The father is killed and the son is seriously injured. The son is taken to the hospital where the surgeon says, I cannot operate because this boy is my son. And think about it for 10, 15 seconds. What is our first thoughts that come to your mind? How can this situation happen? How is this possible? Some of you may know this example. This is a quite well-known example at this stage, but people who don't know, we know that almost 75% of people, they can't figure out this puzzle, up to 75%. Those who do solve it, usually it takes a few minutes to understand what's going on here. Even when we have the best intentions, when we hear the word surgeon or a leader or a boss, the image that usually on average pops into an average mind is often a male. So in this example, the solution is quite easy, actually, because the surgeon was the mother of this boy. So this is what we call implicit bias. And I very much doubt that anyone in this audience thinks that females cannot be surgeons or they cannot be supervisors, cannot be leaders. I'm confident that no one have those explicit assumptions. Then why is it so hard to solve that puzzle? Well, the answer is implicit bias. Implicit stereotypes are shaped by experience, and they're based on learned associations between particular qualities and social categories. So those social categories can include gender or a disability status. Our perceptions, attitudes, and sometimes even behaviors can be influenced by those implicit stereotypes. And perhaps the most surprising part is we don't need to be aware that we have those stereotypes. Of course, when we think about explicit bias, explicit prejudice, things such as stereotypes that we are aware and consciously hold, those explicit biases, they pose a risk of intentional discrimination. And they may take form of active exclusion or derogation. Implicit bias, in contrast, poses subtle risk, but those risks are still significant. Implicit bias can lead to differential treatment, even by individuals who value diversity and by those who consciously intend to be fair. And this is quite scary, right? Implicit bias is associated with biases of omission, such as passive neglect, inattention. For example, the perception that members of stereotyped group are poor fit to the organization. And those things add up. So we may think this is not a huge deal. Those are just attitudes, unconscious, we're unaware of those stereotypes. But even if we think about small effect sizes, and a person, an employee with a disability or a female, every time gets a little bit lower performance evaluation. Over time, we can see how those small effects can add up, and at the end of the road, they can lead to two very different stories. So taking back this to the disability context, how does it happen? Well, first of all, we know that not all disability types are the same. There are many types of disabilities, and people usually use certain labels when they describe a disability diagnosis. And those labels can prompt those implicit stereotypes. And stereotypes are generalized beliefs about members of a particular category. So in this example, that category is that label of a disability. And we can think, well, stereotypes are really, really bad things. And of course, when they're negative stereotypes, also we say about negative stereotypes, we name them prejudice. Of course, there are negative things in this world, but those cognitive categorization processes are also beneficial to our brain. And that's why we still engage in them, because it can reduce information processing demands. But when we encounter negative stereotypes, they have negative, sometimes unintended consequences. So a large proportion of employees, they acquire disability while employed. And this was our objective in a study that we conducted, is to look in the return work context and see, first of all, how do different labels affect managerial evaluations in the return to work context. Does it matter whether we are talking about physical disability or psychiatric disability? We also wanted to investigate, is there a label that does not trigger that categorization processes and those stereotypes? Can we offer some protection? So what we did in this study, we sampled managers and we used randomized vignette experiments. So basically what we did was we presented a medical note, and I should highlight that one of the members of our research team works in HR, and this is something that came from her practice. So she saw those notes and we took an example and we presented managers with those notes, but in those notes, we manipulated the type of label that they encountered. So we looked at 4 different types of labels. We looked at psychiatric disability condition. That label explicitly mentioned on the note, then physical disability condition. Then we also decided, what if we don't put a specific label? So we still disclose a disability status, but we don't say either it's a physical or psychiatric. We just say we don't know. We know that there is a disability, but we don't know which type. And this was referred to as pending diagnosis. And then the last one was a control condition. So basically just an employee returning no information about disability. So in the control condition, we didn't have a disability status. What we found, we decided to measure 3 attitudes. And those attitudes are important because you get, for example, perceived aggressiveness. So we asked participants the extent to which they felt afraid of that person's interpersonal behavior while at work. Or for example, items such as, I'm afraid that this person will shout or swear while at work. And of course, in itself, perceived aggressiveness may be, well, not a huge deal, but if you think about potential consequences of this, a person who is perceived as more aggressive, you can see that another person who interacts may socially exclude that person, may not invite for social events. And again, all those things are extremely important. The next one was professional trustworthiness. And basically, we asked participants items such as, I feel like this person will approach this job with dedication, or I will be able to rely on this person. And again, we can see how that professional trustworthiness can really affect career promotions, performance evaluations. And then the last one, we asked about perceived organizational commitment. So for example, items such as, I think this person will be happy to spend the rest of their career with this company. So what we found was, and you can see here significant differences. So what we found basically was a very clear pattern, and people psychiatric disability label was evaluated as more aggressive, less committed, and less trustworthy compared to the control condition, but also in some cases compared to the physical condition. It's also important to highlight that we didn't find any differences between control condition and physical condition. So at least from the statistical perspective, people did not evaluate people with physical disabilities more negatively than people without disabilities. So what are some implications of those findings? First of all, consequences of that implicit bias can go beyond hiring decisions or performance evaluations. Nonetheless, there are important consequences because you can conduct a mental experiment and just think about how perceived aggressiveness or commitment or trustworthiness can have huge implications for a person's social inclusion or career promotion, performance evaluations. But most importantly, we found that not all disability types are evaluated equally. And of course, disability is complex. And what we found that certain label that we attach, not necessarily a disability status, can trigger those differential evaluations. We also found that a pending label, pending diagnosis, can offer some protection to employees with disabilities. So if a person requires, for example, a job accommodation, or of course, person needs to provide a note why they are returning to the work context, they don't necessarily, when they don't specify the nature of their disability, so they just say, well, there is a disability, but they don't label it, then it may offer some protection, especially when we talk about psychiatric disabilities. And it's important to know that a lot of disabilities, they are not actually visible, and both psychiatric and physical disabilities, they may manifest themselves in similar ways. So they may have very, very similar visible manifestations, but the exact label, if we use pending diagnosis, we can offer some protection. Well, some people may ask, isn't it better to not disclose at all? And I've heard this sometimes from people, why should we disclose a disability if it can have negative consequences? Shouldn't we advise people, especially if they have a case of non-visible disability, shouldn't we advise them just not talk about it? And the answer is not that simple because, of course, disclosure is a personal choice. But it may seem to some people that it might be a preferable option Research on disability concealment and research in other areas, for example, LGBTQ concealment, shows that non-disclosure actually has negative psychological consequences, and it has adverse consequences for people's well-being. The second implication of this, well, shouldn't we just train all employees and offer implicit bias training, and then we'll solve this problem? And strategies such as raising awareness, education about implicit biases, various forms of implicit bias trainings are very, very much common in the organizational context. A lot of organizations nowadays use this training, they promote this training, and they think that they can solve discrimination, including disability discrimination, by using this training. But implicit bias, it's very hard to combat. When, for example, we look at education and implicit biases, surprise, but there is no correlation. We can have a highly educated person, a person who tries to be fair and thinks that that person is fair, but they still engage in implicit bias. Sometimes people think, well, people who have subscribe to certain ideologies, such as more conservative stand or social dominance orientation, those kind of hierarchy favoring ideologies, then those people engage in biases, but not other people who have more liberal attitudes or perspectives. And this may not actually be true, because research shows that there is very weak, it is significant, but very weak association between those ideologies and implicit biases. We also know that implicit bias helps, but if we measure how long this effect holds, it's only one day, sometimes several days. So what it means, if we want to ensure that bias training works within the organization, we basically need to conduct it a few times a week. And of course, this is not a realistic suggestion. And a lot of research that focuses on implicit bias training, what happens is they measure attitudes right after the training. But research that measures those attitudes on more longer periods of time show that the effect of training fades away very quickly. So this is not good news, right? What should we do? Well, traditionally, when we think about implicit bias, the assumption was it's an individual problem. So some people have more biases, they're more biased, and we should train those people. So this is pretty much a problem with the person. But research also shows that implicit biases are not stable individual attitudes, but they predict disparities that are at an aggregate level, such as nations, states, companies. And there is a new approach to this, which is called the bias of crowds model. And in this model, implicit bias is best understood as a social phenomenon that passes through the minds of individuals but exists with greater stability in the situations. Basically, in simple terms, we are social creatures and we get signals from our social context. And whatever signals we get, we translate those signals in stereotypes, including implicit stereotypes that we hold, and subsequently in our behaviors. So how can we combat this problem if we assume that bias, it's not necessarily an individual issue, but it exists within the company as a social structure? So several structural changes organizations can make. So for example, they can and should implement blind reviews processes when we talk about performance evaluations. It's also important to develop decision criteria upfront. A lot of organizations, unfortunately, use subjective performance evaluations, and those subjective forms can really create a breeding ground for biases, especially for implicit biases. But once we share those are objective criteria and employees know what they should do, in what behaviors they need to engage, the process becomes more transparent. And another suggestion how we can change that social fabric is, of course, increase visibility of marginalized groups. And this refers not to just employees with disabilities, but of course, the other marginalized groups as well. And if you still want an advice for yourself, well, the best way to deal with implicit biases is to actually slow down. A way to avoid those things to a certain extent is to try to make a decision when we are well rested, because when we try to make a decision, when we experience fatigue, hurry, or distraction, what happens? We take mental shortcuts. And those mental shortcuts are the definition of implicit bias. So take a break. If you need to make a decision, make sure that you slow down and you have a good night of sleep. Well, and of course, in this webinar, and I'm sure in every webinar, now it's a staple to mention COVID and implications of COVID. And of course, I won't talk about the pandemic and negative consequences of it, because everyone in this audience probably knows. But I will talk about something that we didn't realize probably before the pandemic, and that we can work from home successfully. And work from home is especially beneficial for employees with disabilities. So work from home is a potential work accommodation. There are many benefits of working from home, and we know for across all employees group, we spent less time on commute. It's nice working from home. It can increase our autonomy. It can actually increase our performance and productivity. For employees with disabilities, it can also bring very specific benefits for that specific group. For example, if a person needs to take more frequent breaks, they can engage in those breaks more easily when working from home. It's also easier to focus because we have less distractions, especially if we think about our modern workplaces, open space layouts. It's very hard to focus, right? For some people, it also introduces ability to remain close to their medical equipment. So there are many benefits. These are just some of them. Work from home is great. But as almost anything in this life, it does have two sides of the coin. So work from home does have potential downsides that we do need to talk about if we want to make this work. So work from home can introduce social isolation, professional isolation, fewer learning opportunities, and negative career consequences. Why it's important to talk about this in the context of workplace disability. Now imagine a situation. The pandemic is over, and hopefully at some point it will be over. And what if employees who don't have a disability, they return to work? But employees who have disability decide that, well, work from home is a better alternative to their work accommodation. So now we have structural differences between two groups of employees. And they can be, group with disabilities can be particularly disadvantaged in this case because they can be socially isolated, professionally isolated, they don't have as many learning opportunities, and they can suffer negative career consequences as a result. So how can we mitigate those effects? Well, we can try to make several things and include those structural changes before we return, well, if we ever return back to the office. And we need to make sure that we address proactively those potential downsides of working from home. Well, one way to mitigate this can be to provide opportunities for social interactions. For example, when we have meetings, we can budget in Slack time in those meetings, making sure that we may discuss some non-work related things. So we build opportunities consciously for social interactions. We can also organize social meetings, for example, with breakout rooms for employees. To ensure that managers inadvertently disadvantage careers of persons with disabilities who work from home, companies also need to develop disability inclusive policies that explicitly include guidelines regarding training, promotion, career development. It's also important that we have regular communication with employees, all employees, and this is important for all groups of people, of course. Another important advice here is to focus on outputs instead of visibility and presence. And that's how we can try and mitigate those potential negative consequences, because oftentimes what happens is a person who spends the most in the office is considered as higher performing employee, as more dedicated, as more committed employee. Although they might be as well browsing Facebook or posting on Twitter, because we think that that visibility, that social explicit cue that we have somehow signals their performance, which is not actually accurate. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that in our performance evaluations, in our feedback, we focus on very specific criteria. If the person delivers their work and they deliver good quality work, does it really matter if they spend 6 hours in the office? And actually, if they can do the same job in 6 hours than another person in 9 hours, does it mean that they have better performance? I would think so, but so I just wanted to conclude on this note, saying that, of course, we see implicit bias happening, but not everything is all doom and gloom. There are certain practices we can implement, certain changes, and we can work towards making this place and workplaces a better experience for all employees, including employees with disabilities. And of course, thank you everyone for listening. I look forward to your questions, to your discussions, and feel free to connect with me if you'd like. I would like to chat more about this if you have some ideas. So Dan, it's over to you for questions.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Zhanna, for the really, really informative presentation. I'm kind of amazed that you covered so much ground in 34 minutes or so. It was really great and a lot of practical insights too. I really appreciate how you went over kind of disability type and bias and return to work, and then also really explored how implicit bias training doesn't particularly work and ways to actually mitigate that. I remember I was reading a study about implicit bias training, and what you said really just resonated with a quote that came to mind, where implicit bias training was brought into a workplace, and 6 months later, one of the employees was asked, "What did you learn in this training?" And one of the points of learning was, persons with disabilities are individuals just like you being the people in the audience who did not identify as having a disability, and you shouldn't stereotype someone as pitiable or less than, and nor should you stereotype them as being superheroes or geniuses. It's just a person. And then when they were asked, what did you learn 6 months ago? They said, I learned that persons with disabilities are heroes, that they are superhuman and have all these abilities. So it's very clear that that kind of training doesn't have the effects that we want. So it's great that you went through that. And then also the work from home context. So we have a lot of conversation going in the Q&A and in the chat. And a first point here is just a comment actually from Steve Mantis, which is worth bringing up, especially considering the work that we do and the work, Zhanna, that you brought forward. Steve said, "Good morning all. Today is the International Day of Mourning for workers killed and injured in the workplace. This started in Canada and it has spread around the globe. best wishes to all. And many of us are aware of all the great work that Steve does in that movement. So thank you, Steve, and anyone else on the call participating there. Now, in terms of our questions, Zhanna, our first one came from Michael McDonald. Michael said, my question to you is that you suggest using pending instead of disclosing specific diagnosis is a strategy. So how might we combat the biases that might emerge when we disclose restrictions or limitations?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you so much for this question. So in our design, for example, in all conditions, psychiatric, physical, or pending, they requested the same type of accommodation. And I know this is a very, very specific example because, of course, not every disability would require a specific type of accommodation, but a lot of disabilities, they may require, regardless of physical or psychiatric, they may require actually very, very similar accommodation types. So, and it's not necessarily the request, at least how I see it, and I would love some thoughts on this as well. But I don't necessarily think this is a request for specific accommodation that triggers biases, because, for example, in our design, we hold it constant, but it's that label that people assign to a disability, to a specific disability, that triggers those stereotyping. I'm very, very hesitant to repeat those stereotypes, just because I know from research that when you actually talk about stereotypes, it may backfire because people start thinking about them and they inadvertently, they almost not subscribe, but you kind of build awareness of those stereotypes. So I'm just trying to avoid as much as I can here in this presentation. But I think the point here is it's not necessarily the request, but it's the label that, at least in our example, can make a difference. But I do want to acknowledge that, of course, it also depends on the disability type. And sometimes when you request a specific accommodation, it becomes very obvious which disability type it is. And I think this might be an opportunity for future research to see, okay, what if a signal a specific type with a request for accommodation, but we still don't label it? Would it elicit the same implicit biases processes, right? And I don't think I can make this conclusion from this specific paper, but I hope this answers your question.
It sounds like there's some important new studies to conduct after this one. And our next question comes from Ainsley Latour. Ainsley said, thanks for this webinar. It is excellent. I love this research. And just to add, many other people have written that so far. But then the question component, the different part, is, have you looked at, or are you planning to focus on people with cognitive disabilities? Bracket neurodiversity, autism, brain injury, sensory processing disabilities, and also sensory disabilities which impact cognitive processes?
Thank you so much, first of all, for your kind feedback. I think this will definitely be an excellent future direction. And hopefully one day, once I finish my dissertation proposal, I will have a little bit more time. And I do think one thing that I think resonated with me in this specific project and some other work, it's how complex the disability world is, because oftentimes when you talk to a layperson, they almost assume it as a dichotomous variable. You either have it or you don't have it. And we know even in this work, the categories that we use are very, very broad, and they don't capture the complexity of the disability nature, right? I think, of course, this is a baseline. We show those basic facts, but how we can build on those basic facts is bringing more granularity to the process and looking at, okay, what if we narrow down to even more types of disabilities, even within the same category, such as in this example, for example, psychiatric, right? There are different types. Again, this was a meta category almost. So how we can tease it apart even further and see whether we get differences, or maybe a person who maybe it's possible that a person who is on the receiving end of disclosure, maybe they're not able to differentiate among different types of diagnosis, right? Where is that threshold where a person, a manager, who oftentimes doesn't have a disability, doesn't have experience with disability, how do they react? How can they differentiate? And just a note on this, we did have data on whether the manager had a disability themselves, or also whether they had, I think, a relative or someone within their social network. And we tried to control, and in our study, it didn't make any difference, so it didn't affect our results. But I would imagine more specific question in terms of, did you have this type of disability and how people react? I think this may have certain implications for how people evaluate disabilities. Thank you so much. I think this is a very interesting question and a very fruitful opportunity for future research.
Yeah, your response, Zhanna, really resonates with me too. Just in some of the research I've done, I've always found it very unexpected that when I control for experience or family members with disability, when we're doing implicit bias research, it tends not to have any effect. When you would think that that individual would be more attuned and more knowledgeable, using less stereotypes. So our next question comes from Steve Mantis. Steve says, thanks for your presentation. The research on bias training and its impact over time. Is it transferable to other training on disability that is becoming more common in the workplace?
So the research that I said in this paper, it looked just overall bias training for across different groups, right? I do think it is transferable because the mechanism, the underlying mechanism of social categorization and stereotypes are pretty much, it's similar, right? So we have certain stereotypes in our social context that we're unaware of oftentimes, and then we try to combat those stereotypes with awareness, but as we know from research and meta-analysis. So this was not just one study, it was a quantitative summary of, I think in one case, almost 500 studies, which is a very robust sample size. So we know that it doesn't necessarily work on learned terms. So I would assume if I would make a bet, and if someone tells me, okay, put your money on this, I would say that the process is the same. I think that it is transferable, but of course, I haven't done this specific research and our data did not test that. So I cannot assure with 100% confidence, but if you ask me, I am pretty confident on this one. I would say 80%.
And just perhaps to increase your 80% a little bit too, Steve, to your question, as Zhanna mentioned, most of the literature here is on like gender and race primarily, and often it doesn't look at intersections, it really just looks at one aspect of identity. But I can think of only one study that is on disability and disability-related training, and it shows what you would expect transferable from the other literatures, but again, it's only one study, so you don't want to make the 80% 100% from that. But it's the beginning of evidence there.
Yeah, just to add on this, if I may, I think a lot of companies, and I might be wrong, I think it also may depend on the company, but I think a lot of companies, they lump together implicit bias training and they introduce as many groups as they can, and then they say, well, we did training on gender, we did training on disability, but at the end of the day, it's basically the same training introducing more stereotypes about gender and disability. So.
Yeah, no, thank you. And our next question comes from Doigyu Galsaren. She writes, I wonder if you are aware of any studies that compare people with physical disabilities, mental disabilities, and multiple disabilities. Many employees have multiple disabilities, and I am curious what is the most optimal way of asking for accommodation for such employees.
I've seen studies on the studies that I've seen usually measure just one type of disability, and I've actually seen studies. It kind of doesn't answer that specific question, but I think it's interesting to see mention is studies that looked at physical disability, and in that specific example was wheelchair. They found that employees with physical disabilities are evaluated actually higher than people without disabilities. So, which I think was an interesting part. Of course, it might be possible that it was social desirability effects, etc. Going back to the question about different types of disabilities, I think it would probably, I can draw some parallels with intersectionality literature, right? How people can be further disadvantaged if they have multiple, for example, disabilities. But again, I'm just making some assumptions here and just thinking out loud, because I don't think that I've seen, it's possible that they exist, but it just trying to think about it. I can't think of a study that tested it. And maybe if you know of such study, please, I would love to read it. And in terms of disclosure, I think one way, and again, this is just me thinking out loud in this context, I wonder to what extent the employees really need to say, okay, this specific accommodation is for this type of disability, and this specific accommodation is for this type of disability, because it may not be, in my opinion, the best strategy. I think in this case, what we saw from our research is employees have a right to request disability or disability accommodation, right? So that's their right. And they should be aware that if they don't feel like they want to disclose a specific disability type, or they just want to disclose one type and don't disclose another type, it's their choice. But they are entitled to accommodation. So that's my answer, indirect answer to your question.
Thank you. And our next question comes from Sabrina. Sabrina says, wonderful presentation. Thank you. You mentioned non-disclosure has negative consequences to a person's well-being. Do you know of any specific negative consequences that could occur with non-disclosure?
So that research that I mentioned, it's a lot of this research is done in the context of LGBTQ disclosure. I think there is some research that is done on disability concealment as well. In terms of well-being, it's mostly from what I've seen in terms of research, it's psychological well-being, sometimes mental health. So people who don't disclose it, they feel, imagine that you're hiding a secret constantly and you're trying to protect that secret. And it can cause anxiety, rumination, frustration, negative affect. And of course, well-being is a very broad category, but it's also important to know that a lot of those negative feelings, thoughts, they co-occur. So it's not necessarily a person experiences anxiety and doesn't experience other negative emotions, right? But those negative, it can be stress related, and especially with negative emotions, we know that they trigger stress, higher levels of stress, and stress can trigger sustained stress, distress, and even worsen the disability condition. I think there was some research that I read that it may make it worse. So you conceal, and then and again, this, of course, there are many personal differences, because some people are fine, they don't want to disclose it. But I think the issue arises when you want to share this, but you feel like you can't. and you feel like you need to hide this. And that's when we see those negative effects.
So our next question comes from Tammy Bernaski. Tammy says, "Hi, Zhanna. Thank you for the fantastic presentation. My question is, many people with disabilities struggle with when to disclose their disability, if at all. If a person has a visible disability, for example, there is a dilemma about whether or not this should be brought to the attention of the hiring committee before the job seeker arrives at the interview. There is a fear about biases that might emerge. Did your research uncover anything about the decisions around disclosure? Particularly, are there benefits or challenges to various disclosure practices during the application, interview, and hiring process?"
That's an excellent question. And our research didn't look at disclosing at different stages. We focused on just return to work context. But with disabilities that are visible, you can't really hide it. And research that I read, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but if I recall correctly, it's bad to disclose a visible disability during the interview process right away, to acknowledge it. And because people see it, and in this specific context, when you acknowledge it, you kind of address the elephant in the room. Again, I do think that I'm very hesitant always to provide specific suggestions in terms of disclosure, because I do think it's a personal choice, it's a personal preference. I think we need to strive for providing people with opportunities to do so. So we need almost to reverse it and don't put all responsibility for disclosure on a person who has a disability. Because, and I know this doesn't answer your specific question, but and just the more I read about this, and the more I hear what people say about disclosure, what kind of questions they ask, it almost feels to me that we assume that it's like we need, first of all, we need to give advice when to disclose, and secondly, that the person is somehow responsible for managing the disclosure and the situation, and it's their responsibility to do it in the right time and the right context, so they don't cause any negative possible evaluations. And I think maybe this is not necessarily the question we should be asking.
Your response, Zhanna, resonates. Some of the research that I do is on disclosure strategies, and often what does come to mind is that concern of structural issues probably ultimately require structural solutions, and you can kind of build in like alternatives for the individual to navigate what is there, but ultimately there needs to be something more broader, policy-based, organizational-based, societally-based. And our next question comes from Laura Bulk. Thank you for the work you're doing. I'm curious if there are particular kinds of contexts where you suspect implicit bias is more stark, or where explicit bias is more stark. For instance, in healthcare professions or in teaching, etc.
I'm just, your question kind of brings me thinking about culture, workplace culture. I think when we talk about explicit bias and with intersection with culture, it's important that we think about specific types of biases and stereotypes. For example, I'll give you an example. Maybe we can think more about this so we can understand and brainstorm about the processes, but we can think about, for example, military, which is a highly masculine workplace. I'm assuming, I have never been in a military. But in this work environment, we can see, for example, we can assume how gender stereotypes would be more prevalent and people would feel possibly more comfortable holding those explicit biases, right? In terms of disability, I think one layer that adds more complexity here, it's a specific disability type. So let's say, for example, in certain contexts, if it's again military and masculine environments with masculine cultures, for example, things such as stamina, show no weakness can be very much prevalent. And in this context, maybe a physical disability might elicit more explicit biases, right? Because I think what happens in those social contexts, they signal what people should value, right? So it's a collective hive in terms of how we do things here, what kind of values we expect, what is the right things to do. And in that context, maybe a physical disability, because of just the values they hold, may elicit more explicit bias. And again, here I'm just speculating. I don't know if there's any research on this. And then your question about, for example, education. So we have different values because the value here, it's intelligence, it's your cognitive abilities. And for example, in this maybe environment, we would see that, well, maybe physical disability doesn't matter too much because it doesn't intersect with those expectations, values within the social system. But cognitive disability may perhaps trigger more explicit stereotypes and prejudice. But I think this is definitely something that would be super, super interesting to look into.
No, thank you, Zhanna. I'm just looking at our time here, and we have a lot more conversation in the Q&A and chat boxes, but I know that you need to go soon. So I think it's a great problem to have when we can't get to all of the questions. But I hope everyone who has questions or comments that we didn't end up getting to, that you can send them to Zhanna. You can also, if you don't have access to her email that's on the slide, send me an email, please. I'll send it your way. So yeah, really your webinar was fantastic. I think a lot of people really enjoyed it. Thank you for participating. And for everyone in the audience, if you would like to participate in our future webinars, we have multiple lined up. You can learn about them by joining our mailing list, by going to the CRWDP website. We've got lots of different avenues to learn about the webinars there. And always remember too that on our website, we post previous webinars, so you can find them there. So that's all for today. Thank you again, Zhanna, and everyone for attending, and have a great day.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And please feel free to connect. And it was a wonderful webinar. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for your questions. Really a lot of things to think about. And I wish we had more time.
We'll have to have you come back for another webinar. Bye-bye.
Bye.